Welcome to Learning Life Skills Together. This is our weekly community Zoom meeting where our guests help us to go deeper into the 4 life skills and open up a huge array of chances to practice them. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Zoom meeting. This is number 32 with Bob Lamb. So, as always, we begin with a practice. And right now, we're thinking and working with the idea of emotion regulation. And so one of the things that we can do to help us regulate our emotions is to name what we're feeling. Name it to ourselves, and if it would help in the situation, name it to others. And so I'd like you to just take a moment, and if you would like to close your eyes, that's great. If you're driving, please don't do that. But just sort of check in to how you're feeling right now. You know, the body tells us what's going on. And as we check in and maybe check in sort of on the inside in the area where our heart is, we notice that there's a feeling that we're having. And so that's another name for our emotions. So maybe you could notice what you're feeling right now and see if it has a name. And if it has a name that comes to mind, you could say it silently to yourself. And then notice how that feels to know how you are. So this is a really important skill for our kids to have. And so there are names that of emotions that everybody should know. They're helpful. And there are names that are kind of sweet and kind of cool, and some that are even silly. It's like, you could be mad, or you could notice that you feel vexed, or you're crabby, or you could say, wow, that really burned my biscuits. You know, you could be sad, or you might have the word discouraged, which is maybe different and maybe matches a little better what you're feeling inside at that moment. And so we're looking for that interplay between how we feel and what the word is that we're using to describe it, right? So we could, even if we were feeling sad, say, oh, I think I'm having a pity party. And maybe that brings a little bit of a smile into the whole situation. So we really help ourselves as we build up vocabulary, and we want to always be doing that with the kids, helping them build that vocabulary. So you might, after hearing about this and maybe noticing how you respond, check in right now and see what the feeling is that you're having. Maybe it has a name, maybe it doesn't, but just notice what it's like for you. And if your eyes have been closed, you could open them. And so you have some sense of how you feel. And because we're recorded this week, I can't ask the listeners, but I can ask Bob Lamb, who's with me. How is it for you, Bob, right now? What do you notice? Do you have a name, a word?
Yeah, it started with anxiety. It's
Mm,
always interesting being recorded and
yeah.
put out there and just some other life circumstances. That's kind of where I'm at. But you have a very soothing voice and way of talking, and that brought me into a little bit more at peace and a little bit more relaxed.
Okay. So at peace and relaxed.
Hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so you are the director of operations and programs for Be a Part of the Conversation. And so Be a Part of the Conversation is really kind of an interesting name, speaking of names for
Hmm.
things. And so
Hmm.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Be a Part of the Conversation, how it got that name, how it got
Hmm.
started.
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit based in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, in Montgomery County. We've been around since 2011, and it started as a school district initiative with Hatboro Horsham School District. It was kind of as the opioid epidemic was really starting to hit its peak, and the school district wanted to talk about addiction and not really sugarcoat this is something that's impacting our community, it's impacting our kids, and we need to have a serious conversation in the community to reduce stigma, to let people get connected, and to really just bring to light some good information about what addiction is, and how family members and people could get help for themselves or for their loved ones. Since that school district initiative, it's kind of expanded pretty rapidly, where we do focus a lot on those types of community education programs. And that looks like us talking about, substance use prevention for families, understanding current drug trends, understanding today's substances of use, to what do you do if your loved one does have a problem, or you have a problem, how to do some type of crisis management or intervention, and then supporting family members and parents who have a child or a loved one with a history of addiction or some type of addiction.
Mm.
In addition to that, we do a lot of support through like peer support services for parents who have a child with an addiction. So peer support groups and a lot of education specifically for that population.
Right. Okay.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, this is an area that we haven't really talked about because we've been, really talking about small children. And so
Hmm.
we're sort of moving into this area of teens
Hmm.
and as I was saying, it's good for kids sort of at all ages and all levels of development to have these sort of emotion regulation
Hmm.
skills.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um, and so one way of thinking about how it expands when they're teens is that it's not just, okay, I can name my emotion. It's like, how can I work with it? How can I think about it? Because
Hmm.
as we name it and sort of explore it, all of that helps us to work with it
Hmm.
and to not let it take us over, but we have some sense of, oh, that's what's visiting me right now. Right now, I have sadness.
Hmm.
Right now, I have anger,
Yeah.
and it also changes, and I know that. And so kids, as they get older, really seem to benefit from doing things like journaling,
Hmm.
writing about what's going on with them,
Hmm.
and of course talking and being part of the conversation. And so
Hmm.
so that's kind of the link that I'm drawing here, right?
Yeah.
Is that being a part of the conversation and a part of the conversation about addiction, about, substance use, that kind of thing is more on this emotion regulation piece where, if I can talk about it, then
Hmm.
I'm in a calmer place. I'm not as apt to be impulsive
Hmm.
and make impulsive decisions, right? So I'm
Hmm.
I'm wondering if you could tell us sort of about what you see with teens and parents
Hmm.
and how those conversations work and how they work well.
Yeah. Yeah. So our prevention programs that we run are specifically tailored for parents. So it's really understanding kind of a lot of those things you were talking about is, we have a program specifically for parents of K through 5 kids is how
Mm.
have you had the conversation? So it's really looking at, um, kids are curious. They're going to find out stuff. So, how do you talk about addiction? How do you talk about substance misuse? As these questions may arise, instead of just, kind of pushing it down and saying they're too young, exposing them to it too early is going to lead to problematic, like them
Mm.
maybe wanting to experiment and stuff like that. One of the cool things about that program is we get the fifth graders to use, we try to get fifth graders to ask questions about drugs, and we just keep it as blunt as that. What questions do you have? And you know it's remarkable what they have a lot of questions. They have a lot of misguided information about it, and it's so like the way we phrase that is like, do you want to lead that conversation in your home at an earlier age, or do you want them to learn about it from their friends, or their
Mm.
friends' older siblings, where there may be a little bit more disinformation that's easily spread, and have that become their belief system.
Yeah.
um, so a lot of the ways that when we think about how to have healthy conversations about substances, or if you see addiction in the community, how do you talk about that? And a lot of that has to do with kind of being as factual as possible, using a lot of destigmatizing language, and really not showing shame or blame, or dehumanizing people who may be experiencing addiction, so that that creates this system where if they start to experiment with substances later in life, and they recognize this may be problematic, they may be more willing to get help quicker. One of the other pieces is talking about, if there's family history of behavioral health issues or substance use issues that may, exacerbate and cause substance use disorder later in life, to just kind of be as open and transparent about stuff as possible,
Mm.
so they're getting the most factual information that they can, and just creating that, like, also talking about, like, your coping skills. I think like a lot of the mindfulness stuff that you talked about is really great, because like kids really feed off of the environment. But parents are the number one factor in the child's perspective of
Uh,
substances in the home. So if mom's coming home and saying, I had a really bad day, I need a glass of wine, that may not be the best like example to lay out there. So it's like, the one thing we like to say is like, I had a really stressful day, you want to go take a walk with me, and we can kind of figure out what's going on in the home. So it's like, mirroring behaviors that you want to see in your child. If we want our kids to have healthy coping skills, we need to exhibit healthy coping skills ourselves, which is always, a challenge in today's society. So,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so that's like really the way we like to phrase that when we're talking to parents who have, those younger kids. It's like it's never too early to start talking about it. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I have a 3-year-old and a 6 month old. So I know that I'm gonna have to have conversations with my kids at earlier ages, because it's like, why is, dad going out every night at 8 o'clock? And it's like, I need to stay well. I need to go to my support group meetings. I need to like maintain my healthy, that emotional regulation, that like I didn't
Yeah.
have a lot of emotional regulation when I was a kid, because it just, I had two working parents, and like, they were doing the best that they could, but I didn't have a lot of emotional vocabulary to really, figure out what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's never it's well, maybe it's sometimes too early,
Yeah.
but really not.
It's really not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
think in those terms of
Hmm.
what's being put out there, what kind of language are we using, what are we saying?
Hmm.
Yeah, as
Yeah.
your example was just perfect because that's a thing that learning life skills together has been saying is, come home, say, you know what? Let's go calm down together. Let's take a walk together.
Yeah.
As walking is like a major thing for us because so much happens in that time frame.
Hmm.
It does make us feel better. It changes how our bodies are. It changes how
Hmm.
our minds are operating.
Hmm.
Sometimes just standing up and walking around the room changes how
Yeah.
our minds are operating?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's some research out there that like kids, when they want to have conversations, if they're making direct eye contact with you, they're going to be a lot more reserved. So if you're walking side by side or
Yeah.
like in the car, if you want to have a challenging conversation where they can't look directly into your eyes, like it can really make an impact on the effective communication model that you're like looking for. You're looking for, just some open dialogue. And I thinking back like retrospectively on like when I was in high school and I needed to have some of those hard conversations. Parents are looking at me. I'm looking down at the floor, and
Yeah.
we know it's hard to be a kid today. So it's like you know, just kind of understanding how to have those healthy conversations, like what you can do, and that like walking the side by side in the car. Those are always good things that we like to recommend people do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Hmm.
So we've talked about the younger ones,
Hmm.
and I really wanted to talk to you to sort of bring in the older kids, the tweens and teens, whom we
Hmm.
don't talk specifically about as much in
Hmm.
in what we've been doing in these podcasts so far. So I'm really
Hmm.
sort of anxious and hopeful to give you a
Yeah.
voice in that.
Yeah. So, and like I said, like looking back on my teenage years, I know how much of a challenge I was. And, we know
Mm,
that, it's a lot of those similar things to talking to the younger kids is like when you have that conversation, more frequently, younger, we know that there's good ways to communicate and more like, they're going to be more open to dialogue in the long run. Our, primary prevention program that we've run for that teenage is we have a mock teen bed that really shows like there could be warning signs in the home of substance use. We don't want to scare parents and just being like, this is what your kids are doing today. We
mm.
also like to partner that with the program that we call parenting on your feet. So it's really those like um, effective model or effective ways to communicate and to understand what the warning signs may be and talking about those risk factors for developing substance use and experimentation, but really highlighting those protective factors and what you can
Yeah.
continue to do. If there is an incident of substance use, if there is problematic substance use, or if there is, a substance use disorder. So kind of like going through those buckets um, to really talk about like what would need to be done in those circumstances. But highlighting those protective factors is always something that we like to talk about because we know that there's a lot of ways that we can communicate with teenagers that can decrease their chances of developing a substance use disorder later in life and experimenting with substances to begin with. And really, like we know the science of addiction says if you can delay that onset of first time using of substances to after 21, it really decreases the likelihood of developing addiction. So that's all we're really trying to do
Mm.
with our prevention programs.
Right.
And
So,
go ahead.
yeah, I wanted to ask you about the protective factors. Now, you must have
Yeah.
a pretty good list in your mind,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. And I can,
talking about
yeah.
it as much as you do.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So really, it's those, those like the protective factors that we really like to talk about is, doing those things together as a family, as much as you can. Dinner with the family is always like one of the ones that we really like to highlight. Looking out for good school involvement. is always a beneficial one. Social participation in like school programs, whether that's
Mm,
athletics or clubs.
right.
Yeah, so those are like the big ones is looking at engagement. And then we always talk about having clear expectations of what, your tolerance of, behaviors is, and or that could relate directly to substance use. If there's permissiveness of alcohol in the home, or of underage alcohol use, or other substance use, you need to kind of have your line in the sand there. Um, like I said earlier, we know that like parental perception, their perception of their parental acceptance of substance use is a really big factor in
Mm,
whether or not they're going to use. A lot of people think like that peer group has an impact, and while it does, the parental relationship and the parental expectations of substance use and the perception of that does play a larger role.
mm.
So yeah, those are some of the
Okay.
protective factors that we'd really like to talk about.
Yeah, so the parental or the carer,
Yeah.
how they're putting it out there. It might be spoken, some of it might be unspoken as well.
Exactly.
Has more influence, you're saying, than the peer group.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of what the
Wow.
research is showing
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we always think like if my kid's hanging out with the bad kids, if they knock it off, they'll be good. And it's like, there could just be
Mm,
other, so like looking back for me when I was like experimenting in high school, you know, it those lines were always kind of like vague, and it created conflict where it was like, all right, well, like I did the thing, I did like the punishment, and like now I can go back to doing what I need to do to continue using. And like, I don't think there
mm,
was ever clear, you know, um, expectations. Like, I did, it was like kind of just like I checked off the boxes of like the punishment type of things. So,
mm.
I think um, there always needs to be that like more defined, explanation for what was going on.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like there wasn't a lot of talk.
It wasn't a lot of talk,
Yeah.
and they were doing the best that they could, but like everything else on paper looked good for me. Like I had, so it's kind of, I had some of the protective factors. I was a good academic student. I was involved in athletics, but like, we have a history of addiction in the family that wasn't really talked about.
Mm,
And,
yeah.
yeah, it was like kind of like that, some stuff was talked about and addressed well, and some stuff wasn't. And it kind of needs, to paint a full picture of what the expectations are. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
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 that's really comes right into that name it to tame it kind of
yeah,
frame, doesn't it?
uh-huh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So emotion regulation, is kind of our skill that's in focus right now, but we have other ones as well. We
Mm-hmm.
have four skills. We have the skill of attention, the skill of emotion regulation, the skill of tolerating distress,
Mm-hmm.
which is that's everybody's challenge. And this,
Mm-hmm.
as you were saying, my parents were doing the best they could, and
Mm-hmm.
that is when we're really looking at that distress tolerance piece. Is
Mm-hmm.
things are really difficult for me right now. How do I
Yeah.
get through it?
Mm-hmm.
What are the choices that I make to get through it? And then finally, the sort of the capstone skill is effective communication. So
Mm-hmm.
to be able to speak as the kid, what do I need in this moment? You know,
Yeah.
what do I need? And I mean, you get multiple bonus points for knowing what anybody else needs. But
Yeah.
but when we're looking when we're and that's successful adults. But
Hmm.
when we're looking at the kids, just to be able to look in for them to look inside and say, you know what I need right now, you know what's going on with me. So I'm wondering
Hmm.
how that comes out in your programming.
Yeah, and like since we don't directly interact with kids, it's all like this hypothetical is like,
Right.
the it's really, not that we put it on the parents, but like it's that mirroring the behaviors in your kids you want to see. So it's
Yes.
that's like really the big piece that we love to kind of hammer home, for lack of a better term, is, I know that to if I want them to talk about their emotions and their vulnerabilities and their challenges and their hardships, I need to talk about that, either with my partner in front of my kids or to my kids, in a respectable manner, or an appropriate manner. But that's like really, what we really love to talk about is, how do you, get to that point where you're okay talking about the hard stuff in life. And with like, the Instagram and the social media, the glorification of perfection, that adds another level of challenges, because a lot of
Yeah.
times all they see is perfection. And even though it's, behind the camera, it may not always look that.
Right now, no, that's really so important, and that's another whole topic that that
Yeah.
actually next week we're gonna dive into.
Hmm.
But this idea, I mean, it's true of both our programs. I mean, learning life skills together is for the parents to have these life skills and help share them with the kids, and so we're kind
Hmm.
of in that same space of you know,
Hmm.
how do we help the parents to be able to talk to work with themselves and then
Hmm.
have those vulnerable conversations?
Hmm.
So what are some of the pointers that you sort of bring out in your programming?
Yeah, and like really it's just, try and do it, and you're gonna mess up, and you can always say when you mess up.
That
You
that
know,
is so true and so effective.
yeah,
There's nothing
yeah,
quite like that. Oh, I'm sorry. I really shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have said
yeah.
it that way. Yeah,
Hmm.
that really shifts how we
Yeah,
perceive each other. Yeah.
yeah. And like, I know just for me, and it may not be, it's kind of just like dissolved into my life, but like finding those other peers that I can start having these conversations with as well was a big piece for me.
Mm,
Figuring out, how am I feeling? How am I doing? If you don't have this practice as a kid, it is like one of the most uncomfortable feelings ever to be, in your 20s for the first time being like, I'm sad and I'm hurt and I don't know why, but I just need to let somebody know where I'm at. And the relief that comes from that, even, or just like, I don't know. It's just always, um, finding people that you can have those challenging conversations with, will help you develop the skills that you need to do to do it with your kids. And I think
yeah.
that, yeah, yeah. And like,
Yeah.
just try to like, that practice what you preach, is kind of what it all comes down to.
That's so important. I mean, to have that sense of community
Hmm.
around you.
Hmm.
To know that there are other people who are going through the same thing. And so,
Hmm.
I mean, you're working through the schools, so there is a little bit of a sense. So your kid's in grade 7 too,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, and so we have something in common.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
So is that how you picture it? Just the parents being able to find others? Do you do things to build community? What happens around that piece?
So are things to build community, or specifically once, like if a family member recognizes that their child may have a problem that's a little bit more than that, early stages of experimentation. one of the things when we get into, we've been doing a lot of programs educating schools on, vaping and cannabis and nicotine and all the that's kind of, and always, talking about alcohol. Those are kind of the hot topics for schools to talk about when it comes to substance use. And when other parents, when a lot of our programs, we always try to tie either a person with lived experience in recovery from that specific substance or a parent who's had their child go through something like that. And, the relief that, parents and family members hear when another kid has gone through something like that, or a parent has a child who's gone through something like that, and that like me too, they can relate to them on a emotional level, allows for a deeper connection. Um, so we run 21 support group meetings a week specifically for
Wow.
parents, caregivers, guardians who have a child with a history of addiction. There in and of itself, there's a lot of community, there's a
Yeah.
lot of learning, a lot of education. And then in addition to that, we run a family recovery course, which is a peer-led educational program that does like a deep dive into addiction and its impact on the family system, and then how the family system can heal with a loved one with addiction in the household or in the family system. So that's the primary audience that's drawn to be a part of the conversation is parents and family members who have gone through loving somebody with an addiction.
Right.
And there's not a lot of resources available in the community that support specifically that
Yeah.
audience. So that's the community that we find within people who are going through some serious struggles. But in addition to that, when we do our programs with our school districts, a lot of people just you know are happy to find other like-minded people who are trying to figure out how to navigate parenting together. We do a lot of stuff with the school districts in schools, and they can keep coming back to our programs and seeing the same families and other parents who have kids that are going through similar life stages and developmental challenges and all of that. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it strikes me, because of what I'm working on here, is that so much of it has to do with the language that we use. I
Hmm.
mean, people are coming together and figuring out how to talk about these things,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to talk, the words to use, what to say, kind of changes how we feel
Hmm.
about it too.
Yeah.
It's really an important service that you're bringing there
Hmm.
in having people be able to come together and talk in that way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, and our in-person programs, we always let people like go into breakout groups, and like, that also just like, it can be intimidating to be in like a lecture hall and like raise your hand
mm,
to ask a question. When you're in those
yeah,
small groups, you may feel at peace, you may feel like a little bit easier to talk to somebody and either ask questions, say my kid's struggling with this, I don't know what to do. And like, we have a plethora of resources we're always willing to connect families with if they, recognize that there is some struggle and need for additional support.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so, um, how can people get in touch with be part conversation is one thing.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
our website is like it's got a lot of resources. Due to the nature of COVID, we have a lot of stuff that's still Zoom, accessible. We do live programs on
mm,
Zoom a couple times a month. And then we have a YouTube page with recorded programs if they're looking for additional information on just kind of understanding various areas related to substance use. And then it can connect you to those support groups, the family recovery course. So I can provide you all with that information.
Right. Yes, we would
Yeah.
really like to put that in the show notes, as they say,
Yeah.
and make sure people can get in touch with you and help
Hmm.
explore, what be a part of the conversation has to offer.
Hmm.
And then I'm interested. This is something that I do with everyone who comes on
Hmm.
comes to our meeting, um, and that is to ask you for a few words of wisdom, or if you want a watchword,
Hmm.
to sort of consolidate what we've been talking about here.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and this is a question I speak a lot about my own personal experience in recovery and with an addiction. And the one thing I always get is people ask me like, what do you wish your parents would have done, or what do you
Hmm.
wish would have happened differently that may have not led you down that path? And a lot of it is what, you're talking about is that, you know, defining that emotional, vocabulary and defining that emotional regulation at an earlier age so that if there is struggle, we have that language to recognize our problems and that, ability to say, hey, I need help. So start those conversations early, have them often, and, yeah, I think that's it.
Cool.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
thank you.
Um, yeah. So thanks, Bob, for talking with us and
Thanks, Don.
giving
Thanks for
giving
having
us
me.
your wisdom.
Hmm.
And so we will put your contact information in the show notes and in our resource on our resources page. And I want everybody to remember that right on our front page, you will see a giant 988. And if you need help, that is the place to call first. Okay, so thanks everyone.